I love traveling. As someone who has a wide knowledge of American geography and an interest in different places, I enjoy going to these places for myself. Throughout my life, I have traveled to many places. So today, I'm going to be talking about my traveling experiences. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 38 on October 15th, 2021. So the way this storytime will be structured is I will first go over where I live, then I will discuss a little bit of family history. Afterwards, I'll talk about my uncle and where he lives, as this place is a big reason why I've traveled a lot. Then I will discuss the history of my traveling experiences. I'll then wrap up the storytime with some top 10 lists of places I've been, as well as a list of every state I've been to. So first off, where do I live? Well, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Well, not exactly. I live in a suburb of Charlotte, but I just say I live in Charlotte because I live in the Charlotte metro area. Anyways, I of course live in a suburban lifestyle, which I think is perfect for me. I don't have to deal with all the crime and expensive housing and utilities that come with big cities, but I still have everything near me for my leisure, and I'm only a 35-minute drive to Uptown. I've lived in the same suburb all my life, although in a few years I'll probably be moving out of the suburb and probably even out of the Charlotte area, and maybe even out of North Carolina, which is really fun to think about. So now how about we discuss some family history. Let's talk about my grandmother. So she was born and raised near Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1969, she and her parents moved down to Asheville, North Carolina. She then got married here as well in the mid-1970s. They would move to Charlotte. They would have 3 boys. The oldest of them is my dad. The middle child is kind of insignificant, and the youngest is the uncle that I'll be discussing more in depth later on. But both my dad and the middle uncle were both born in Asheville, while the youngest was born in Charlotte. However, in 1979, my grandparents divorced. My grandmother would have custody of the kids. My grandfather moved back to Asheville, while my grandmother stayed in Charlotte. Then in 1994, my grandfather married another woman. This woman is who I'm talking about when I talk about the grandmother that lives in Asheville. They stayed together until my grandfather passed away in 2016. I was 12 years old when he passed away. Now, I also want to mention my mom's side. So they've always lived in Charlotte for as far as I'm aware. Mom was the youngest of the children on their side. My grandparents on my mom's side had 4 children, 1 boy who is the oldest and 3 girls. Now let's go back to my dad's side. So my dad and 2 uncles each took a different path. Dad went to college and got an associate's degree, although he went to work for a few years, but then he went back to college and got his business and administration bachelor's degree. My eldest uncle went straight into the workforce. He never went to college, but he currently works a position that normally requires a college degree because he's received many promotions and has gained trust within the business he works for. Then my youngest uncle, he went into the military. He specifically went into the Air Force, so he did his basic training in Dover, Delaware. Afterwards, he was stationed in Saudi Arabia in the late 90s. After coming home from Saudi Arabia, he ended up meeting his wife in Dover and as a result decided to live in Dover rather than in Charlotte. Unfortunately, in 2013, his wife, my aunt, passed away. Even so, he still chooses to stay in Dover to take care of her family, as well as because it was where he did basic training. We visit him very often, and he and his 2 kids visit us often too. This explains why I've been to states like Delaware and Maryland, and even New Jersey, as we'll see later on. So now that all that information is out of the way, let's talk about the history of my traveling experiences. I'll start out by discussing pre-2014 travel, and then I'll talk about individual trips. Firstly, I'll of course go ahead and mention my uncle. So we've traveled to his house so much that I can't even count how many times I've been there. I can't even determine the first time I went up here, although if I had to guess, it was in either late 2004 or early 2005. Anyways, Dover is generally about 8.5 hours away. Sometimes it's less than 7.5, although it really depends on Washington, D.C. traffic, as we go through D.C. to get there. But even though it is so far away, we still normally just drive all the way up there. The drive isn't too crazy though. All we do is get on 85, and then get on 95, then take the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, go through East Maryland, and then go through Delaware. However, there are instances of us taking different routes. An example of this was sometime in early 2010s. I don't remember it exactly, all I know is from what mom and dad have told me. So 95 was under construction, which is a big deal, since this interstate goes from Canada all the way to Miami. So that messed us up. Therefore, we had to reroute the trip. To do this, we got off 85 a little early. Normally, we get off of 85 and get on 95 in a city called Petersburg, which is about 30 minutes south of Richmond. But for this trip, we got off at 85 in a town called La Crosse, which is just 15 minutes north of the North Carolina-Virginia border. From here, we got on Highway 858. which runs through southern Virginia. This took us to Norfolk. Norfolk is a fun city because it has Highway 13. This highway includes an underwater tunnel that connects mainland Virginia to that one island part of Virginia that Maryland and Delaware are on. According to my parents, I was mind blown when they said that we were going through an underwater tunnel on the car ride. This highway took us all the way to Dover. Another example of rerouting the trip has been done multiple times. The last time this happened was in July 2019, so I can rely on my memory rather than my parents. So for some reason, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge was closed, so instead, we had to stay on 95 a little bit longer. Therefore, we ended up going through Baltimore. If you know anything about Baltimore, you know that this is like the only part of Maryland that is not super wealthy. It also is insanely dangerous. And to top it all off, we were driving at night. So if we were to get shot at, it wouldn't really be too much of a surprise. However, all we did in Baltimore was get on Highway 40, and then right before we reached Wilmington, we took Highway 1, which took us down to Dover. One final example involves the method of transportation. So there are 3 instances where instead of driving, we flew up there. There's not an international airport anywhere in the entire state of Delaware, so we had to fly elsewhere that's at least close. In 2008 and 2012, we flew into Baltimore. In 2021, we flew into Philadelphia. The Philadelphia flight will be important later on, so keep that in mind. Now, normally when we are in Delaware, we don't really do a whole lot. Most of the time, we just stay in their house and doing whatever. In the summer, we occasionally go to their grandparents' house, as they own a pool, but that's all we'd really do. Because of this, Mom normally doesn't come with us. But that's not to say that we've never done anything. An example of us doing something would be in July 2013. We took a ferry from Rehoboth Beach to Cape May, New Jersey. Cape May is the most southern point of New Jersey. We then proceeded to spend the day here, mostly just walking around as well as eating at this one pizza place. Now how about we talk about going southeast? So this is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. This is an extremely popular tourist spot around the country, especially in the southeast. My parents used to really like it, so we used to go here pretty much every summer. We used to get a hotel room and stay for a whole week. However, this was pre-2014. Starting in, I'd say, 2014, Myrtle Beach became so commercialized that it began developing big city problems, like pollution, traffic, and the worst part, crime. Myrtle Beach now commonly ranks amongst the most dangerous cities in the entire nation. So then later on, we would go elsewhere, but more on that later. So how about we discuss traveling out west? Of course, by going out west, I'm talking about Tennessee. So geographically speaking, Tennessee is quite similar to North Carolina. Although it is landlocked, it still boasts the mountains to the east and then some kind of Piedmont-like land in the middle and western Tennessee. Nashville is also like their Charlotte. I've been to Tennessee many times, but almost all those times involve being on the east side, which is of course where Great Smoky Mountains are. More specifically, the city of Gatlinburg, which is about an hour from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Gatlinburg is a really cool city with a lot to do. One of those things is a big-ass convention center. Now, my mom used to own a business prior to becoming a teacher. This is a competitive cheerleading business. They traveled a lot for competitions. Multiple competitions were held in Gatlinburg, so we traveled here a lot. While the competitions sucked and it was easy to get bored, Gatlinburg itself is a really fun city with a lot to do. So how about we jump to 2014, more specifically August 2014. So my parents decided to not go to Myrtle Beach this year. Instead, we were going to go to Florida. We were going to go to Destin, which is a beautiful beach city just 2.5 hours from Tallahassee. But before that, we were first going to spend 2 nights in Atlanta. I had never even been to Georgia before, so this was exciting. Georgia was also the final border state, meaning I had now officially been to every state that borders North Carolina. We stayed in one of the 3 downtown areas. Atlanta's a strange city because it has like 3 downtowns, which makes absolutely no sense. Anyways, it was that one downtown with the Westin Tower and the Olympic Park where the hotel we stayed in was located. The first night we saw a Braves game. They played the Nationals, and the Braves won. This was also in the old Braves Stadium, since this was like 3 years before they got the new stadium near Sandy Springs. I specifically remember going to run the bases. This is where children, I believe, from like ages 7 to 14 could run the bases after the game and get a t-shirt. It was pretty cool. Me and my sister both got to do that since I was 10 and she was 7.5. Then the next day, we pretty much just explored Atlanta. We went to the Georgia Aquarium. This place was really cool and super massive. If you ever find yourself in Atlanta, I highly recommend going here. This was the first of 2 times I visited the aquarium, as we'll see me going here again for a field trip in March 2016. Afterwards, we went over to the Olympic Park. The 1996 Olympic Games was held in Atlanta, so we walked around and got to see many of the stuff from the games. Afterwards, we went over to the Westin Tower. Here we went to the very top floor. Back then, the Westin Tower used to spin around. Here you can get a full 360 view of the city from the tower. You could also order drinks and stuff too. Unfortunately, in 2017, a 5-year-old boy was crushed from the moving platforms and passed away. As a result, the tower no longer spins, but I'm still glad I got to visit before it stopped spinning, because it was so cool. There's just something special about laying on a sofa and moving around while enjoying a Dr. Pepper when you're up that high. I'm not one for heights, but that view was incredible. And then the next day, we headed out for Atlanta, and we headed out of Atlanta and went to Florida. So to get to Destin, we also went through southern Alabama. Anyways, we got off of 85 about 30 minutes from Montgomery. We also hit the Central Time Zone, which was also the first time I exited the Eastern Time Zone. In fact, this is the only one of 3 times I have been outside Eastern Time Zone. The others would be in April 2015 and June 2018. The very west part of Florida, including Destin, is all Central Time Zone, so it was a little weird turning the clocks backwards an hour. And then we arrived in Destin. This was overall a really fun trip. The sand was super white, the water was also a clear emerald color. This was strange to me, as I could actually see my legs through the water as well as the fish swimming around me. The Gulf of Mexico has a different shade of water color than the Atlantic Ocean for some reason, so this was really cool. Anyways, I don't really remember a whole lot other than that trip, mostly because it's been over 7 years, but Destin was nice. Luckily, there weren't any Florida men throwing alligators at us, so we got back safely. So then let's jump to 2015. 2015 was a very difficult year for me, as that August was when I began the 6th grade. This was of course when I transferred to an intermediate school where I knew absolutely nobody. It was also a weird year because this is when Mom closed her business and pursued teaching. So let's start off in April. So this is when Mom did her final cheerleading competition. This took place in Nashville. Nashville is in north central Tennessee. Therefore, it's no longer in the mountains. I also do not have much memory of the trip other than the fact that the convention center we went to was massive. And also because this is the second time that I went into the Central Time Zone. The final time will be, of course, will also be a Nashville trip. Now let's jump a little bit to August 2015. So we really liked going to Florida back in 2014, so we decided to do it again. But instead of going to Destin, we went to Daytona Beach, which is about an hour and a half south of Jacksonville. This city is infamous for the Daytona 500, which is a huge NASCAR event. I don't watch NASCAR, which is quite rare for someone who lives in Charlotte since we're big on NASCAR here, but I think that's what it is. Anyways, unlike Destin, where we first went to Atlanta, we did not spend the night in another city. We did, however, pass by both Savannah and Jacksonville. As a result, Jacksonville became the largest city I had ever been in. It would hold this title all the way until July 2021, which I'll discuss later on. Anyways, Daytona Beach was also really fun. The water was much more normal to me since we were by the Atlantic Ocean rather than the Gulf of Mexico. I do recall the waves being huge. Of course, 11-year-old me loved huge waves, so this made the beach even more fun. That's all I remember from being here. That's all the quote-unquote unique travels in 2015. I do remember going to Dover to visit my uncle that December. I remember while sitting in traffic in Richmond, I was on my new iPod playing Bloons Tower Defense and listening to music. Good old days. Wish I could go back to them. So then comes 2016. So let's first start off on March 18th. So our school did a trip for all 6th graders. As mentioned earlier, this trip was a day-long trip to the Georgia Aquarium. We had to get up really early though. I believe I got up at like 5. The reason is because we left at around 6:30. Atlanta is about 3.5 hours from Charlotte, and considering we also wanted to beat the rush hour traffic too, we needed to leave early, so that's what we did. I particularly remember the exact moment we reached Atlanta. We saw the CNN headquarters. Now, throughout 6th grade, we watched CNN Student News. This was a daily 10-minute news video hosted by Carl Azus, who describes current events in a way for middle schoolers to understand, so we all started making Azus impressions. Then afterwards, we reached the aquarium. We were all split up into groups of 5. I was with a friend at the time. We would stop being friends 2 months later, as well as 3 boys whom I was cool with. We pretty much just got to go anywhere we wanted to, just that we had to be back at a certain time. Us 5 mostly looked at all the exhibits. We also got our picture taken in front of a whale shark. After a while, we grouped back together and got to see a dolphin show. We could choose where we wanted to sit. The first few rows were rows where you pretty much were guaranteed to get wet. The other back rows were rows where you wouldn't get wet. I sat in the back since I didn't want to have to do the whole ride back home wet. The other 4 boys in my group sat at the very front, and wow, this show was so cool. Seeing them ride dolphins and do all those tricks was so cool. However, the boys who sat at the front were extremely soaked at the end. They ended up getting a towel to dry off at least. Afterwards, we got to see Happy Feet in 4D. 4D is basically when the effects of the movie are done to you. So in Happy Feet, a lot of crunching of ice and water dropping occurs. So we actually got to feel the water. We also got splashed whenever there was a splash. The theater was also really cold to represent the Arctic, which while really uncomfortable, was a very interesting and super cool feature. This was probably the most unusual way I've ever seen a movie, but it was still really fun. And then we left. We arrived back at school at around 7:30. It ended up taking us around 4 hours to get home, as by the time it hit rush hour, we were in Greenville, South Carolina. The traffic there can be a pain in the ass sometimes. Traffic was also backed up at Spartanburg, South Carolina as well. But overall, a really fun trip. I had a blast. By the way, if you're interested in my full experience of this trip, I highly recommend watching Storytime 27, which is on my entire 6th grade school year. It's a really interesting storytime too, so you kind of get a 2-in-1 deal with it. So let's jump a little bit to that August. So in August, we decided to go back to South Carolina. Florida was way better, but it was much more expensive. However, we didn't go back to Myrtle Beach. Instead, we went to North Myrtle Beach. It's a lot safer and less commercialized than Myrtle Beach, so it was a much more family-oriented vacation place. Now, instead of getting a hotel room like we always had, we rented a beach house just 1 minute from the beach. This house is just a tad smaller than our house, so it did make us feel like we were at home. It also was cheaper than actually renting out a hotel for a week too, so that was a score. Now, I don't really remember this trip a whole lot. Obviously, it's been 5 years since this occurred, but also because I don't really remember a whole lot from North Myrtle Beach trips, as we'll come to find later. But from what I do remember, I remember there being a shit ton of jellyfish in the ocean. I got stung at least 5 times. Turns out, jellyfish often migrate to South Carolina shores in August and September, so knowing this, we would plan out all our future North Myrtle Beach trips in July, as well as once in June. So now on to 2017. So we did not travel much in 2017. We went to North Myrtle Beach in July of that year, although I have almost no memory of that trip. We also went to Delaware to visit my uncle in that December, which was also pretty forgettable. So let's jump to 2018. Now, contrary to 2017, I did a lot of traveling in 2018, therefore I have a lot to talk about for 2018. Let's start off with my first ever trip with my current church. So I began going here in May 2017. I became involved with a youth program in July of that year, and so January 2018 was when I participated in my first church trip, being Winter Retreat 2018. So this trip was in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. This trip took place between January 13th to 15th. Pigeon Forge is right next to Gatlinburg, so I was somewhat familiar with where we were. Now, I did an entire story time on this trip, being Storytime 31, so therefore I'm not going to discuss it completely, but to get to the gist of it, we went to 4 concerts. We also went go-karting in 25-degree weather on the 14th, and that's pretty much it. Now let's fast forward to about 4 months later and talk about a school trip. It lasted from May 2nd to May 5th, 2018. We went to Wilmington, North Carolina. This is a large coastal city just an hour and a half north of Myrtle Beach. This trip, while expensive, was for all 8th graders. However, there was a limited number of spots available, so we had to sign up as fast as possible at the very beginning of the year. I did that and reserved my spot. However, this trip was heavily influenced by a pretty funny situation that occurred on March 28th. So long story short, I tried to jump a tennis net. I failed and broke both of my arms. Once again, I explained the situation much more in depth in Storytime 36 if you are interested. That Storytime is also a fan favorite as well, so I definitely recommend it, as everyone else really loves it. The drive up there was about 4 hours, well down there was about 4 hours. Normally, Wilmington is only a 3.5 hour drive from Charlotte. However, it hit rush hour when we were in a city called Lumberton. Lumberton is about 30 minutes south of Fayetteville, so that explains why everyone was on the road at the time. But it seems like the school planned for the traffic, as we arrived at our hotel right on time. We already had our roommates and our room planned out, so that wasn't a big deal, unlike a future trip. Fuge. So that night, we went skating. I did not skate, since although my arms were no longer in splints, they were still very fragile. So instead, I mostly hung out at the arcade. My parents gave me a bunch of money to use on the trip, so I played some arcade games. One game in particular I played was the one game where you stack blocks to try to get to the top. If you get to the top, you win a pretty good prize. So I played a few times. I then got super consistent at it. But then I hit a magical attempt. I was now only 4 tiles away from receiving a big reward. I had aroused a large audience of about 40 people behind me. I kept my concentration though. 3 left, 2 left, and now 1 left. Everyone around me was cheering me on and going crazy. They of course then stayed silent in order to let me get this last one. And then I pressed the button one last time, and it was a hit. I won. Everyone behind me, as well as myself, went insane. I ended up winning $50 from it. So that was a fun night. The next day we woke up and headed back out. The first thing we did was go to the Wilmington Aquarium. Definitely not as massive as the Georgia Aquarium, but still pretty cool. I remember getting my picture taken in the jaws of a megalodon, but that's all I really got from the visit. I believe like the 6th grade trip, we were free to roam around the aquarium, just that we had to be with our group and be back at a certain time. My group would have been my roommates. Afterwards, we got on a boat and went to an island some scientists were studying on. On this boat, we all sat down while a scientist, who stood the whole time, told us different stuff that goes on at the island. He also discussed different animal species and different plants that appear on the island. Then we reached the island, so this was the dirtiest part of the entire trip. We started out by hiking through the beach and through the dunes. During this hike, we encountered many different plants and animals that the scientists were talking about. We also screwed around a little bit in an estuary to find some aquatic animals, although I don't remember what they were exactly. And then we got back on the boat and headed out. Now my shoes were really muddy. It also happened to be the only pair of shoes I brought with me, but that's when I had kind of a 300 IQ moment. I decided to clean my shoes in the bathtub in our room. While I was doing that, my roommates were questioning what the hell I was doing, since you don't normally see some people clean shoes in the bathtub. I told them, and they got onto that idea too, so they cleaned their shoes as well. That night we went bowling. I was able to do this since it wouldn't affect my arm. I'm also right-handed, and I only had minor fractures on my right arm, so I was able to participate. I bowled with my roommates. So then the next day, this is of course our final day. The first thing we did was tour the USS Wilmington. This is a battleship used in World War II. This thing is also huge. I remember also buying a ship in the bottle at the gift store after our visit, although I no longer know where that ship in the bottle is. Afterwards, we went to the beach. This is probably what my arms affected the most. I couldn't get in the water, as it would be dangerous for salt to seep through the scar of my left arm. At the time, I was able to get back in the water about a month after this. I also could not put sand on my arm, so no holes could be dug. Dad knew this, so that night I was packing up, he recommended that I bring a football to Wilmington, so I took it. This is when football became useful. Even though our teachers had brought footballs and other, let's just say, sports equipment, that stuff was pretty old and not really good. My football was brand new, so me and around 40 people started playing football. Tag football, of course, because I didn't need to be tackled with a broken arm, but it was fun. Then came that night. So this is when we rode a ferry that took us out into the ocean. We had a huge party on the ferry, but let's just say that some pretty funny shit happened. One instance was dancing. So music was blasted super loudly, and there were also 2 poles inside the ferry, and being 8th graders, I think you can guess what some people did. Some people started pole dancing. They didn't strip or anything, but they were dancing off the pole. The funny part though is that some others started throwing money at them, pretty much replicating an actual strip club, just without the stripping. The teachers had to get involved and tell people not to pole dance, since that's obviously not something 13 or 14-year-olds should really be doing. Another funny moment on this boat involves 2 boys. So both of these boys like doing flips. Front flips, back flips, sometimes motorcycle flips, you name it. So they did a flip face-off. Everyone, myself included, crowded around them 2. Each of them took turns doing a flip. The winner was determined by who got the audience to cheer the most. We all cheered so hard for both of them to the point that the music, which was already blasting at full volume, was not even audible. It was overall a really funny moment and definitely a highlight of the trip. If you want to know more about this trip, then you can check out Storytime 10, which was on my entire 8th grade school year. However, in 3 weeks, I will be redoing that Storytime, and I'll explain the Wilmington trip in much more detail. Maybe one day I'll even do an entire Storytime dedicated to this trip, as a lot happened and a lot of drama happened here too, so that might be an interesting Storytime to do. So then let's jump to next month, being June 2018. So from June 13th to 17th, we went to Delaware for an annual trip up there. Like most Delaware trips, this was forgettable. However, I do remember the ride up there. We took a different route. Instead of taking 85 like we normally do, we instead took 77, as we were told that this is a much more scenic route to Delaware. It then took us into a town called Max Meadows, Virginia, which is about 50 minutes south of the Virginia-West Virginia border. From here, we got on 81. This interstate took us through Roanoke and Harrisonburg. Then we reached a city called Strasburg. From here, we got on 66, which took us through Washington, D.C., and then from there, we took the normal path. While it was definitely more scenic, as we were driving through the mountains, it was a much longer drive. We also got in a bunch of traffic in Roanoke, so we haven't taken this route since. However, the day after we got back from Delaware, being June 18th, I was off again. So this was for another church trip. This was huge. Like Winter Retreat, I did an entire Storytime on this trip, that being Storytime 29 if you're interested. It's definitely in my top 5 favorite Storytimes, so I definitely recommend it. So Fuge took place in Nashville. This was of course my second time in Nashville, as well as the third and final time I've ever been in Central Time Zone. It lasted from June 18th to June 23rd. It took place at Belmont University, which is a private Christian school just a few minutes south of downtown Nashville. So if you saw Storytime 29, you know that I didn't exactly have the best experience here. I ended up getting left out and then laughed at for getting left out, which started a pretty nasty conflict that I'm not going to go into detail about since this isn't the Storytime for that. Also want to mention the weather. Nashville is a very hot city. Fortunately, most of what I did was inside, so I didn't sweat too much. But when I was walking across Belmont's campus, oh god, I got tired really quickly just walking, as the high was always over 100 degrees every day we were there. I like hot weather, but even that's kinda high. I also want to mention Wednesday, June 20th. So on this day, we as a church went to downtown Nashville. We were then split into different groups, each one led by a youth leader. We walked around downtown some. Of course, music was playing everywhere we went. After all, Nashville is known as Music City for a reason. I also remember us looking over the Cumberland River. This was really cool. Afterwards, we regrouped as a church and then ate at this Italian restaurant, whose name I forgot. We all ate spaghetti. Now, I don't like spaghetti, but I did really like the spaghetti served. Like, it was actually really good. So that's all I really have for Fuge. I'm not going to mention the rest of this trip since almost all of it took place on Belmont University's campus. Therefore, if I did, I would be talking about my experience at Fuge rather than my experience in Nashville. Then in July, we did our annual North Myrtle Beach trip. This is a fun trip. Once again, like most North Myrtle Beach trips, I don't really remember a whole lot from it, but I do remember having fun on this trip. So then let's talk about that August. So a few months prior to this, my parents got tickets to see Noah's Ark. This is a life-size reconstruction of Noah's Ark from the Bible. It was located in Williamsburg, Kentucky. It's just 50 minutes south of Cincinnati. We also had tickets to the Creation Museum, located in Petersburg, Kentucky, just about 40 minutes from Cincinnati. So we took a trip to Cincinnati in northern Kentucky from August 3rd through August 5th. So we stayed at a hotel that was right next to the Cincinnati airport. For some reason, the Cincinnati airport is in Kentucky, even though Cincinnati is in Ohio. We still drove through downtown Cincinnati, so I still got to add Ohio as a state I've been to. We did not take a plane though, we instead drove all the way over there. Cincinnati is about a 7-hour drive, which isn't too bad, especially since I've been in car rides all the way to states like Delaware and Florida, although we did get in a little bit of traffic in both Knoxville and Lexington, both of which weren't too bad though. Speaking of Delaware, when we arrived, we were greeted by some very familiar faces. That would be my uncle and his kids. Yeah, they came over. This is a surprise to both me and my sister, as we didn't know they were coming with us. Unlike us, they actually flew over to Cincinnati, since it's like 9.5 hours from Dover, although they still had to do a little bit of driving, as Delaware doesn't have any national or international airports. The nearest one to them was Philadelphia, since they live in the Philly metro area, so they had to drive about an hour and 30 minutes to the Philly airport. So then we went to the Creation Museum. It was pretty cool. We got to see a bunch of cool exhibits and even got to see the place where the founder of the Creation Museum debated Bill Nye. Afterwards, we went to eat. However, we first went on 275. This took us into Hardinsburg, Indiana. Even though I was only in Indiana for like 15 minutes, I was still in that state. So therefore, I also got to put Indiana on this list of states I've been to. So 275 put us into Ohio, so we just ate somewhere in Cincinnati. Afterwards, we went back to the hotel. So the next day, we went to the Ark in Petersburg. This thing was absolutely massive. Like, there were so many different levels and so many rooms on each level. Pretty crazy that Noah managed to build this like 4,000 years ago. So we toured the Ark around. After that, we went over to downtown Cincinnati. We didn't do a whole lot. I do remember while getting gas, it started thundering and lightning, so we had to wait it out. Fortunately, our van was under the gas station roof, so we just waited it out then. Afterwards, we went back to our hotel in a pretty interesting way. So of course the hotel was in very northern Kentucky, Kentucky is separated by both Ohio and Indiana geographically through the Ohio River. So what we did was that we got to take a ferry across the Ohio River. This is a really neat way of going back to the hotel room. It kind of reminded me of when we took the ferry to New Jersey back in 2013, just that we were in our van rather than walking around or inside the ferry eating a snack. And then the next day, August 5th, we headed back home. Now, the final trip I want to discuss took place from December 26th to December 28th, 2018. So for this trip, instead of going up to Delaware like we normally do, we instead met the Delaware Baynards in Gatlinburg, so this was of course another Gatlinburg trip. However, I didn't enjoy myself much here. We mostly spent our time shopping and never really did anything else. We would come back here again about 2.5 years later, which I'll talk about more in detail since it was very recent. So finally, 2018 is wrapped up. Yeah, 2018 was one crazy ass year. Maybe most of the craziness wasn't even from traveling, and traveling was crazy in of itself. So let's just move on to 2019. So unlike 2018, I traveled a lot less than I did in 2019, but I still traveled some. So let's start in January. So this was when I did Winter Retreat 2019. Now, unlike 2018, this is a high school only trip. I was a freshman at the time, so I was eligible. Just like in 2018, we stayed in Pigeon Forge. However, instead of getting hotel rooms, we rented out a large cabin. Here we all did pretty much everything, so there's not much to talk about in regards to activities. But if you are interested, then I made an entire Storytime dedicated to Winter Retreat 2019, being Storytime 13. It is really old though, so the quality isn't exactly the best. Now, if you did watch Storytime 13, you know that this trip went pretty similarly to Fuge. I got left out again, but unlike Fuge, it was also really cold. I'm not a big fan of getting left out or freezing to death, so this wasn't a good of a trip. The next trip wouldn't be until July. I already talked about it earlier, as this was the trip that we had to go through Baltimore, but I also want to mention on our way to Delaware, we actually stopped in Richmond, Virginia. Here we ate at a Firehouse Subs. I remember Mom and Dad ate at a separate table than me and my sister. I believe we both sat at a high table rather than in front of the window. We just joked around and ate our food. It wasn't much, but I do remember it for some reason. We did not do our annual North Myrtle Beach trip that year. We were planning on going, but my sister had cheer camp that week and we were going to go to the beach, so we had to cancel it. The final trip I have to talk about for 2019 is another school trip. It was from August 7th to August 9th. So I go to an early college high school. Here we get both a high school diploma and an associate's degree when we graduate. It's also an expeditionary learning school, which is a curriculum that focuses very heavily on hands-on learning. To accompany this, we do a thing called intensives. Intensives are activities that pretty much teach us anything from the expeditionary learning curriculum. Sometimes these involve taking field trips, like in this case. By the way, in case you're interested in learning about my entire experience of this trip, I highly recommend watching Storytime 33, as I pretty much discussed every single detail about this trip. That Storytime was about my sophomore year as a whole. So for this trip, we went to a city called Blowing Rock, which is in a very northwestern North Carolina. Of course, the funny part about this place is its name, as it's definitely a very humorous name, especially when you consider what word rhymes with rock. That's what one boy had on his mind. So when we saw the Welcome to Blowing Rock sign, he shouted, "Well boys, we've reached Blowing Cock." Everyone, including myself, started laughing. We all still joke about the city's name even 2 years later. Now, the place we stayed at wasn't a hotel. However, it really wasn't a camp either. In Storytime 33, I called this the intensive place, since I can't seem to determine what this place is exactly. But for the first night, we just hung out at the intensive place. We also did a few things involving expeditionary learning. The next day is when the real activities began. Blowing Rock is up in the mountains. Because of this, it takes a little bit longer to get around, so therefore, bus rides were very long in between events. Another geographical feature about Blowing Rock is that it's founded off a river called New River. New River pretty much flows across the Appalachian Mountains. This river is also home to many unique aquatic species. So we first went to the New River Research Center. Here we did two things. The first thing we did was we looked out the balcony. In front of us was a pretty awesome scenery of the forest as well as hiking trail. We were given 2 sheets of paper. We were then ordered to write how this made us feel, as well as draw out the scenery. We would go on to use these for a project. The other thing we did was learn about different aquatic animals that live in New River. We simply learned about how to identify them and all, so not really too big of a deal. Afterwards, we actually went over to New River. Here we all got in the river and looked for the animals and pretty much captured them. Now, how it worked was that everyone had a cup, but there was someone else who had a bucket that they dumped their animals in. The person with the bucket brought it to the scientists we were working with, who processed the animals and did a bunch of other stuff that scientists do. I was the person who had the bucket, so I ran around and captured the animals from everyone and gave them to the scientists. It was really cool. The river also was very slippery. I think everyone fell at least once. I fell multiple times, but it was still really fun. Right after that, we took a 2-mile hike. This is probably not the greatest idea since we were all soaking wet and our shoes were all wet, but we still did. I recall one moment where we as a grade played the whole creeper aw man meme. We all took turns singing one line each, since it was such a huge meme at the time. I believe the scientists even got involved too. So great memories. Afterwards, we headed back to the intensive place. Some pretty funny stuff happened, although I'm not going to talk about it right now since it isn't really related to traveling. Then the next day we went home. Even though the trip itself kinda sucked, since the planning was pretty bad, I made some great memories up there and still had some fun. So that's all I got for 2019. Let's move on to 2020. 2020 was a really bad year for all of us, as coronavirus came in March and screwed up our plans. That happened to me. In April, we were going to go to the Bahamas via cruise ship, but of course that got cancelled. I believe we were actually going to be going to the Bahamas in 2022 to celebrate me graduating high school, so at least I'll still be going since I really want to go. But that's not to say we didn't do any traveling in 2020. In July, we returned to doing our annual North Myrtle Beach trip. However, all we really did was quarantine in the beach house and go out into the beach, so we didn't really do much. Then in December 2020, me, my sister, and dad went to Delaware. It was pretty much the same deal as the North Myrtle Beach trip, as all we did was quarantine in their house. So that brings us to 2021. Yes, the current year. So 2020 was an absolute mess. We agreed on that, so we decided to travel more now that things were opening up. And oh boy, did we travel this year. Almost as much as we did in 2018. So let's hop into it. So let's start off with April 16th through April 18th. So my sister does competitive cheer. They had a competition in Gatlinburg, so we were kind of living in the good old days of back when mom used to own our business, just that we had a lot more free time since mom didn't have any part in the company my sister cheers for. So let's talk about this trip, as it surprisingly went very well. So the drive up there was really crazy. We got into a shit ton of traffic when we reached Hendersonville, which is just a few minutes south of Asheville. Apparently something was going on that day, so we were a little bit late getting there. So the first day was more dedicated to shopping. It was good though, as I got to buy some stuff too. We also ate at the Chop House, which is a really fancy restaurant in Sevierville. Definitely recommend it if you find yourself in Gatlinburg or anywhere else in eastern Tennessee. And then the rest of the night we didn't do much. The next day, April 17th, my sister had her cheer competition. Fortunately, I didn't have to sit there and watch it, as dad didn't want to either, so we both just walked around Gatlinburg. We also played at an arcade as well as just hang out around the hotel room. Then the next day, before we left, we took the lift up the mountains. This is really scary, as I'm not a height person, but then we reached the top of the mountains, and holy shit, this view was incredible. I got a few pictures, and wow, it looks stunning. Then we went down. On our way down, we spotted the bear. We also spotted the bear with our cubs too. Definitely not something you see every day. Afterwards, we headed back home. So now, let's jump to June. I have 2 trips to talk about. The first one was a day trip to Raleigh, North Carolina. I had been to Raleigh before, just that I hadn't been there in recent memory. I went here for private reasons. But what's interesting about this trip is that I drove here. Raleigh is about 3 hours from Charlotte. This means that Raleigh is the farthest place I've ever driven to. The drive wasn't too bad either. Only 2 issues arose. The first happened in Greensboro, so I almost fell asleep. That is probably the last thing you ever want to do when driving period, let alone driving in a big city. Fortunately, I managed to stay awake, so it's all good. I especially needed to stay sharp and focused here, since I was now merging onto I-40. The other one occurred in Chapel Hill. There was a ton of construction going on, which kinda made me nervous, but I managed to get through it and got to Raleigh. Mom drove back home, so I didn't have to worry about that. However, she went a different way. We first went to Cary to get food. Cary is a large city about half the size of Raleigh, just southwest of Raleigh, but then for some reason, she drove through downtown Durham. Not sure why the GPS had us going through Durham, but okay. The other trip we did was our annual North Myrtle Beach trip. We did it here as a way of celebrating my 17th birthday and to celebrate Dad's 50th birthday. It lasted from June 19th to June 25th. Like all North Myrtle Beach trips, it was kind of forgettable. However, there was a memorable part of this one in particular, being driving. I drove a lot. We brought my truck down here to help with loading stuff to the beach and back. I drove all the way to Florence, which is about 2 hours from Charlotte. Now, like the Raleigh trip, we did drive through a big city midway through the trip to get to our destination, that being Columbia. The Raleigh one was Greensboro, in case you're wondering. Surprisingly, Columbia wasn't all that bad, which is surprising because being a large city, I would have expected to get in a bunch of traffic, but nah, it worked out great. Anyways, we then reached Florence. Florence is a city in northern South Carolina, just about an hour and a half south of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Here we ate Zaxby's. However, afterwards, Dad took the wheel and drove the rest of the way. On the way back, he drove the full way. So now let's just fast forward a little bit to July 3rd. So the Delaware folks were over at our house. They're like us. They really like Major League Baseball. Only thing that is that we have different teams. We're Braves fans, since that's technically our home team, while they're Nationals fans. So on Saturday, July 3rd, we drove down to Atlanta and saw the Braves play the Marlins. Unfortunately, we lost, but it was still fun nonetheless. Like the Georgia Aquarium trip back in 6th grade, this was a full day trip, as Atlanta is only 3.5 hours away. I believe at around 8 o'clock, we ate at Longhorn Steakhouse in Duluth, which is 30 minutes northeast of central Atlanta. We ultimately did not get home until 12:30, mostly just because of both Atlanta, Greenville, and Charlotte traffic, as well as because 85 can be a bitch in upstate South Carolina. Now let's discuss the final and most recent trip I took. This trip lasted from July 29th to August 1st. This was another Delaware trip. However, it was extraordinary compared to other Delaware trips. Instead of going to Delaware and just hanging out at their house, we instead flew to Philadelphia. So let's talk about that. But before I do, I want to mention that Dad has been begging me to talk about this trip in Storytime since we did this trip. So I guess here it is. I haven't talked about much in any Storytime since I kind of had all those Storytimes planned out. And I also planned about talking about this Storytime. So here we go. So this trip was just me and my parents. My sister did not go. Instead, she went on a trip with her friend to Key West. This is actually really interesting, as she was so down south while we were up north. We were really far apart. On July 29th, I woke up at around 6 in the morning. My parents were like every other parents. They got to be at the airport like 5 hours before that flight actually begins. I then packed up my stuff up and we headed to the airport. So Charlotte Douglas is a massive airport, which is kind of expected since it's the 18th busiest airport in the world. Dad, however, knows this place left and right. He travels a lot for work, like he's been to Germany twice. He's also flown to many large cities such as Chicago and Houston, so I kinda envy him, but his knowledge of where everything was helpful. Anyways, we got through the TSA, which wasn't too bad. We'll see on the way back that this was a pretty big pain in the ass. We also got some Chick-fil-A too. Then the flight began at around 10:30. Getting up in the air felt super weird. It felt as if all my organs lost their support and started flowing around my body, but after a few seconds, I got used to it. We were then in the air, so I just simply whipped out my Switch and played Metopia for the rest of the trip. Then at around 12 o'clock, we reached Philadelphia. This meant that now, Jacksonville officially lost its place as being the largest city I've been to after 6 years of holding that position. Me and my parents then walked out of the airport. Finally, some fresh air. It was, however, a little cold. I just lost my I lost my voice. We are up north now, so it makes sense. But it was strange because that day, there was a huge heat wave in Charlotte. Like, I believe it hit 100 degrees at one point that day. So we pretty much missed the heat wave, which is definitely a good thing. So instead, we got to enjoy the 80-degree weather. Afterwards, we got a rental car, and oh god, this thing looked really funny. We referred to it as the Ratmobile for the trip, as it's kind of what it looked like. It kind of looked like something old women drive. However, this thing had a lot of modern driving features that made driving much easier. It would notify you if there was a car beside you. It could also tell you directions to different places with its built-in GPS, so that was neat. So we put that GPS to the test by asking it to take us to Citizens Bank Park, and that's what it did. Although in reality, we didn't really need to bother with it, as like the airport, Citizens Bank Park is sounded off 95, so we just needed to follow the interstate and we'd see it. Now, Philly does something pretty interesting in regards to sports. Southside Philly has a plaza with all their major league sports stadiums. Glaringly, they have their baseball field here, but they also have their football, basketball, and hockey stadiums. I'm not too sure if I really like this. It's convenient since they're all next to each other, and so you don't have to wander around downtown to find each one, but the traffic before and after games is already bad enough. So if there's both a Phillies and Eagles game in September, oh god, I can't even imagine the traffic. Of course, this is in July, so football wasn't on. So pretty glaring, we
Glaringly, we saw the Phillies. They just so happened to be playing the Nationals. The Delaware Baynards met us here, so we watched the team. The game. Of course, they pulled for the Nationals. We pulled for the Phillies since the Nationals are our rival. So this was not a normal baseball game. The day before, I think due to weather, they had to pretty much call off the game. So for this day, they played only a 7-inning game. I believe it was like the second or third inning. The Nationals managed to score 4 home runs in a single inning. My cousin then said, "Alright, we won, let's go home." However, karma kind of bit him in the ass. Throughout the rest of the game, the Phillies recovered from that terrible inning. Then on the bottom of the 7th, the Phillies managed to tie the score. This is of course put the game in overtime. Each team was now going to play an inning. Of course, being the guest team, the Nationals went first. They scored 1 home run. This meant that the Phillies needed to score 2 home runs to win the game. They now had 3 men on their bases. They had 2 outs and their batter had 2 strikes. The batter didn't hit the final ball. It was a home run. The Phillies managed to make a comeback. My uncle and cousins were absolutely pissed. My parents and I were happy, not because the Phillies won, but because the Nationals lost. That's all that matters. But after the game, there was a pretty funny situation that happened. So a lady was selling hot dogs, but now that the game was over with, she pretty much understood that she wouldn't be making any more money, so she just shouted free hot dogs. So I went over there and got 2 free hot dogs. She said that I could take the entire tray, which was about 25 hot dogs. I didn't do that, not only because I knew that I couldn't eat 25 hot dogs, but also because I didn't even think 25 hot dogs could even fit inside the Ratmobile. So I just took two. I'm glad I took 2 though. The bread of the hot dogs sucked, but the wiener was good at least. So afterwards, we went to Delaware and went over to their house. We then ate dinner and then that was that. The next day we went to the beach. The beach really wasn't that enjoyable, mostly because it was just abnormally small. The water was also freezing cold, and the waves were super intense, so it was a little difficult to have fun. Then the next day, July 31st, was a big day. So we were back on the road and headed out to another big city, this time the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Now, I've been past Washington, D.C. multiple times, as we always drive past it whenever we go to Delaware. We even pass the Capitol building and Lincoln Memorial whenever we drive to Delaware. However, I had never really explored DC, which I had always wanted to do, as there is a ton to do in DC. Now, my uncle's kids were not too enthusiastic about this trip, since they both took a school trip to DC. According to them both, it sucked, but that didn't stop me or my parents, as we were excited to go. So the first thing to mention when discussing Washington, D.C. is driving, because wow, driving through D.C. is chaotic. I didn't drive, but I saw Dad struggling, and he's been driving for 34 years. What really messed Dad up were the lanes, so they just randomly ended without warning, so he pretty much had to stay in the left lane at all times so that it wouldn't stop on him. Another problem was the stoplights. In DC, the stoplights are on the left-hand side rather than hanging over the traffic. This screwed up Dad a lot, as he almost ran a few red lights. Not sure why they don't put the stoplights above like literally everywhere else in the country, but I mean, that's DC for you. So we then parked and began walking around. The first thing we saw was the World War I Memorial. Then we went over and went to the Washington Memorial. On TV, it doesn't seem that large, but actually being there in person, this thing was gigantic. Like it was taller than many of the skyscrapers near us. This thing was huge. We then went over and saw the World War II Memorial. The World War II Memorial also was a large fountain. Surrounding the fountain are 50 monuments, each one representing a state. Me and my parents went over and found the North Carolina one, while my uncle and his kids went and found the Delaware one. Afterwards, we took a pretty long walk all the way over to the Lincoln Memorial. During this walk, we spotted the White House. We couldn't really go anywhere near it since Biden was trying to work on the, you know the thing. Biden jokes aside, we then reached the Lincoln Memorial. However, to actually go inside, we had to climb a long flight of stairs. After climbing more stairs than what's really necessary, we reached Old Abe Lincoln. Like the Washington Monument, this is also a lot bigger than what you might think it is. I got to take a picture of it. We then went to the back of the Lincoln Memorial and rested for a little bit. In front of us was downtown DC, so we also had the skyline in front of us too. Then we got up and moved again. Climbing down the excessive amount of stairs wasn't nearly as bad as climbing up them. However, our next stop was the Capitol building, which is about 2.3 miles away. By the way, we did a ton of walking on this day, so I at least got some exercise in. So then after about a 45-minute walk, we reached the Capitol building. The building wasn't really fenced up, but it did have a fence over its steps. Dad then took a picture of me in front of the Capitol building. Also, another funny thing too is that Congress was actually in session when we visited, so I mean, that was kind of cool too. That was the final thing we did in DC that day. We were all tuckered out and ready to eat, so we left. However, we didn't go straight home. Instead, we stopped at this one restaurant in Maryland. I believe it was on Kent Island, although I'm not too sure. It was by the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, so that should explain things. We ate at a restaurant called Hemingway's. We had a very long wait and the service wasn't the best, but the food was super delicious. I forgot what I ate, but from past messages on Discord, it seems like I really enjoyed the food, probably because I had been walking around DC all day. The next day was the first day of August. It was also the day we flew back to Charlotte. However, there was a bit of a conflict that occurred in regards to the TSA. So typically, TSA agents are pretty rude. This TSA agent though was on a whole different level. Like it felt like we were in Philadelphia or something. Oh wait, we were. So Philadelphia International has a bit of a different process in regards to security. I didn't know this, so I assumed that it was the same as Charlotte. Turns out I missed a step, and this dude just went beyond scared straight on me. Like this wasn't even the worst part. The worst part is that he had a robotic voice too. Like I didn't even hear a word he was saying, which in my opinion made him even scarier. I ultimately did the thing at least, but damn, what an asshole. Like I get you hate your job and would rather be a pilot, but damn, there's no need to yell at someone who's 25 years younger than you. He also did the same thing to Mom as well, so if anyone needs proof that Northerners are rude, then here's my proof. After that mishap, we took the plane back home. Overall, it was a great trip, other than being scorched by a TSA agent, of course. So that's pretty much my history of traveling. How about we talk about organizing where I've been? So to start, I'll go ahead and list every state I've been to. So obviously, I live in North Carolina. In the South, I've been to Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Alabama. In the North, I've been to Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, and Indiana. So how about we talk about state capitals? In the South, I've been to Raleigh, North Carolina in June 2021, Richmond, Virginia in December 2020, Nashville, Tennessee in June 2018, Columbia, South Carolina, June 2021, and Atlanta, Georgia in July 2021. In the North, I've been to Annapolis, Maryland in July 2021, and Dover, Delaware in August 2021. Now let's talk about the 10 largest cities I've been to by city population, not metro area. I'll just read out what they are, what states they're in, and the last time I've been there, their population, and maybe some extra information if needed. Population numbers come from worldpopulationreview.com. So the 10th largest city I've been to is Cincinnati, Ohio. I went here in August 2018, and the population of Cincinnati is approximately 307,000. The 9th largest city I've been to is Lexington, Kentucky. I went here in August 2018, and the population of Lexington is approximately 324,000. The 8th largest city I've been to is Raleigh, North Carolina. I went here in June 2021, and the population of Raleigh is approximately 470,000. The 7th largest city I've been to is Atlanta, Georgia. I went here in July 2021, and the population of Atlanta is approximately 500,000. The 6th largest city I've been to is Baltimore, Maryland. I went here in July 2019, and the population of Baltimore is approximately 622,000. The 5th largest city I've been to is Nashville, Tennessee. I went here in July 2018, and the population of Nashville is approximately 678,000. The 4th largest city I've been to is our nation's capital, Washington, District of Columbia. I went here in July 2021, and the population of Washington, D.C. is approximately 714,000. The 3rd largest city I've been to is the city I live in, Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't really need to explain when I've been to Charlotte, since I live here, although the last time I was in the Charlotte city limits, as well as in Mecklenburg County in general, was in September 2021, but the population of Charlotte is approximately 910,000. The 2nd largest city I've been to is Jacksonville, Florida. I went here in August 2015, and the population of Jacksonville is approximately 930,000. This brings us to the largest city I've been to, being Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I went here in August 2021, and the population of Philadelphia is approximately 1,585,000. This also makes Philadelphia the only city I've been to that has a population of over 1 million people. So now how about we count down the top 10 largest metro areas I've been to. Metro areas are general surrounding areas of a large city. People living in metro areas often work in the city, but don't have to deal with all the crime and expensive housing. That's of course my situation with Charlotte, as I live in the metro area. It's also the case with my uncle in regards to Philadelphia. Anyways, let's begin. The 10th largest area I've been to is the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill metro area. Sometimes Cary is included, but I'll just exclude Cary since it's in Wake County, so it's kind of part of the greater Raleigh area. This metro area's nickname is the Research Triangle, as its location of the 3 very big colleges, being NC State, Duke, and UNC Chapel Hill. These 3 colleges are also huge rivals in sports, so that causes a lot of tension in this area as well. The population of the Raleigh metro area is approximately 1,410,000. The ninth largest metro area I've been to is the Jacksonville metro area, which pretty much serves the greater Jacksonville area. Even though Jacksonville is such a large city, it has such a small metro area. I think the reason for that is because Jacksonville is actually the largest city in the United States by land area. By land area, it's over 3 times larger than Charlotte. As a result, since most people live directly in Jacksonville due to its size, not as many people live in its metro area. The population of the Jacksonville metro area is approximately 1,600,000. The 8th largest metro area I've been to is the Hampton Roads metro area. The metro area consists of Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Newport News, and a few other big cities in southeast Virginia and in northeast North Carolina. Virginia Beach is for some reason the largest city in this area, even though Norfolk is a lot more commercialized as well as the biggest city I've been to in this metro area. I've also found that strange. The population of the Hampton Roads metro area is approximately 1,700,000. The 7th largest metro area I've been to is the Nashville, Davidson, Murfreesboro, Franklin metro area. Yeah, Nashville probably wins the award for having the most drawn out name for a metro area. And for some reason, Davidson is in the metro area even though Davidson is not a city. It's referring to Davidson County, which is the county Nashville is located in. Not sure why they did that, since Davidson County represents the greater Nashville area. The population of the Nashville metro area is approximately 2 million. I don't know why I said 200. The 6th largest metro area I've been to is the Cincinnati metro area. This metro area goes pretty much through southern Ohio, northern Kentucky, and southeastern Indiana. The population of Cincinnati metro area is 2,232,000. The 5th largest metro area I've been to is the metro area I live in, being the Charlotte, Concord, Gastonia metro area. This place has been growing super rapidly over the past few years. The Charlotte metro area is like the Austin, Texas of the southeast. Everyone's flocking over here, and it's starting to get out of hand because they're bringing their crazy shit with them. The population of the Charlotte metro area is approximately 2,790,000. The 4th largest metro area I've been to is the Baltimore, Columbia, Towson, I don't know how to pronounce that city, metro area. Even though I haven't been to Baltimore since July 2019, I was actually last in the Baltimore metro area just this past July. On our way to DC, we had to drive through Annapolis, the capital of Maryland. Annapolis just so happens to be in the Baltimore metro area, something I actually did not know until I did the research for this story time. The population of the Baltimore metro area is approximately 3 million people. The 3rd largest metro area I've been to is the Atlanta, Sandy Springs, Alpharetta metro area. Even though Atlanta itself is a lot smaller than many other cities such as Charlotte and Jacksonville, its metro area is absolutely massive. In fact, it's the 2nd largest metro area in the southeast, only behind Miami. The population of the Atlanta metro area is approximately 6 million. Yeah, that's a huge jump from Baltimore. Once again, I cannot read millions. The 2nd largest metro area I've been to is the Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington metro area. Even though I've only been to Philadelphia once, I've been in the metro area multiple times. Dover is included in the Philly metro area. The metro area also extends into 4 states: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. The population of the Philadelphia metro area is approximately 6,100,000. Finally, the largest metro area I've been to is the Washington, D.C., Arlington, Alexandria metro area. DC is a lot like Atlanta. Even though the city itself isn't nearly as big as other cities, its metro area is massive. Washington, D.C. just so happens to have so many high-paying jobs, so it makes sense why people call Virginia, West Virginia, or Maryland home. The population of the Washington, D.C. metro area is approximately 6,320,000. This also makes D.C. the metro area the 6th largest metro area in the United States. So that's all I got for today's story time. Next week, on October 22nd, I'll be talking about doing and working vacation Bible school. Anyways, that's all I got, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!